Hello, and welcome to this installment of the Future Grind podcast. I'm your host, Ryan O'Shea. Today I'll be speaking with Britt Wray, a host of the BBC podcast Tomorrow's World and the author of the book Risks of Necrofauna, The Science, Ethics, and Risks of De-Extinction. Her book focuses on the idea of resurrecting extinct animals, such as the woolly mammoth and the passenger pigeon, and whether or not this is possible, ethical, and safe. It also includes a foreword written by famed Harvard geneticist George Church. Throughout her work, Britt focuses on the ethical issues of emerging science and technology, creating stories which she tells through radio, TV, print, and public speaking. My introduction to Britt was kind of a funny story. I was recently featured in a New York Times article, and I met up with the photographer for that project in California. Her name was Arden Ray. And through our conversations, I found out that her sister, like me, hosted a podcast exploring the societal impact of emerging science. So it was really a fortuitous thing, and I'm excited that it led to this interview. As always, show notes and more are available at futuregrind.org. We're on iTunes, Stitcher, and wherever podcasts are found. A video version of this episode is posted on Facebook and YouTube. Make sure to subscribe on all of these platforms, and please take a few seconds to leave us a review. You can also like, comment, and share to spread the word. This is Future Grind. And now we are here with Britt. Britt, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me. Hi.
So you were the author of the book Risks of Necrofauna, The Science, Ethics, and Risks of De-Extinction. Let's start this off by defining what exactly you're talking about here. What is de-extinction?
Sure. De-extinction is a scientific movement, really, where a variety of researchers using different techniques, whether that be cloning, backbreeding, or gene editing, are trying to recreate very close versions of extinct species. So it's not undoing extinction. It's not reversing death and actually somehow allowing woolly mammoths to resurrect and become part of this planet once more. It's using the genetic materials of long gone extinct species and then cobbling them together in new ways in their closest living relatives in most cases in order to create these hybrids or facsimiles or close approximate versions of extinct animals. And at the end of the day, researchers hope to be able to create new animals through these lab-mediated processes that can look and act and therefore carry out the ecological roles of extinct species.
So your research and previous work has spanned multiple disciplines, and there are many topics that you could have written a book on, but you chose this. How did you become interested in de-extinction, and what fascinated you about it?
Well, I had studied conservation biology in university and was really passionate about the work that conservation biologists do. I think they deserve an incredible amount of respect because they are fighting a very difficult fight in this moment of mass extinction. And they also have a very, very difficult time trying to convince other people to care about what they're doing and make a difference. So I was steadily following news in conservation biology years after I had studied it and decided to not become a conservation biologist, but to work on science communication. And I received an email one day in 2012 telling us about a new development where there was an interview with a woman who was trying to fund research around de-extinction, particularly de-extinction of the passenger pigeon, and was couching this research as a conservation tool. And I thought, oh my goodness, this is wild. People are talking about trying to reconstitute the genes of extinct species in living birds that they would be able to modify so much that they create birds that can look and act like the extinct passenger pigeon. And they're doing it for conservation reasons. And a bunch of bells just went off in my head. I thought, this is fascinating. This sounds like science fiction. So what are the technical realities that make this possible now, so that we should be taking it seriously. Who's behind it? What are their motives? Are there any possible ways that this could go wrong? And also, it sounded a bit troubling to me. It sounded like it could be a techno fix rather than dealing with the root of the problem, which is extinction, and possibly some kind of Band-Aid solution. And I wanted to find out more, so I set out to make a radio documentary about it, which is what first got me into the field and meeting all the people who are heading these projects with different candidate species for de-extinction, and then also looking at all the ethical questions and legal issues surrounding it. And I was hooked. So after I had made 3 different radio pieces about this topic, I got an email from a publisher one day asking if I'd be interested to expand on that research and turn it into a book, and I jumped at the opportunity.
Wow, that's an interesting story. And like your book, this podcast is interested in emerging science and technologies, but our larger focus is on the social, ethical, legal, and philosophical issues that those emerging technologies present. You mentioned in your book that while there are aspects of de-extinction that you can get behind, you make no blanket statements of approval and that you do not wholeheartedly support de-extinction. What are the concerns that you have?
That's right. I have a variety of concerns about de-extinction, and I think that it needs to be taken on a case-by-case basis in terms of scrutinizing each candidate species and wondering, is it a good idea to de-extinct the gastric brooding frog versus the woolly mammoth versus the Tasmanian tiger or the passenger pigeon? The list goes on. We can't treat them all the same because each species had different requirements, different biotic needs, environmental factors, ways of affecting the land, and if the true point of de-extinction is to create animals that can roam free again in the wild and actually restore the ecosystem productivity of a certain area that has become somewhat depauperate since the original species went extinct there, which is the justification narrative that's used. It's a theory of ecological restoration rather than making a bunch of oddities to live in captivity or sit in a zoo and entertain humans and make us think about how wonderful our technological powers are in order for us to actually achieve that. So, if we're serious about getting animals back into the wild, we need to think about what's there for them in the wild. Is there enough habitat? Is there enough food? Is there a possibility for these species to become invasive and harm the current flora and fauna that are there at the moment? What about human communities? If any human communities are living nearby the intended release areas, are they going to be happy and welcoming to have these recreated animals living near them, should they ever get made? Because we can look at restoration projects of ecosystems as we already have it and see how perverse a lot of the situations can become when humans are dealing with animals that get reintroduced and they don't want them there. They simply shoot, shovel, and shut up, which is what some conservation biologists told me about their experiences with trying to restore populations of endangered species in areas where humans don't want them. So, we need to think about the welfare of these animals down the line if they're going to be able to manage themselves in the wild. But also before that, there's a lot of animal welfare issues when it comes to cloning, for example. There's a lot of death and failure. And we could see that a lot of embryos and fetuses and animals fail to make it out of the lab alive, which, is something that gets skirted over a lot because there's a lot of animal experimentation that happens in biotechnological experiments. But when we look to Dolly the sheep, the famous adult animal clone example that took the world by storm in the 90s, it was over 277 attempts to just get one Dolly the sheep that we all learned about and came to love. But we didn't hear about all those other failures along the way. And de-extinction has only happened once before in the sense of the last individual member of the species being cloned back to life, so to speak, because the genetic material of that last individual was used to make a clone a couple years later in the case of the bucardo, which is also known as the Pyrenean ibex, a type of mountain goat that lived in Spain, and the last individual, Celia, a female, died when she was crushed to death by a tree in a conservation program in the early 2000s. But when She was crushed, and her monitoring collar let off a sound that notified her caretakers something was wrong, and they rushed out to find her. They immediately started picking away at her ears and her flank, taking skin samples, cell samples, and freezing them on liquid nitrogen so that the cells wouldn't start to decay after death. Because if they started to decay, then the pH inside the cells would go off balance, and the enzymes would start chopping up the DNA and degrading the integrity of the DNA inside the cells. But because they were frozen and prevented from decaying, that meant that a couple years later, experiments could be done, taken out on those cells in order to try and clone Celia, the last Picardo, which they did. After 57 implantations in a variety of different surrogate goat mothers' wombs, they were able to finally get one pregnancy to come to term and give birth to the first ever de-extincted animal, which was using Celia's DNA. However, that small cloned Picardo only lived for 10 minutes because it had a lung deformity and failed to thrive, which is pretty common with cloning experiments, that there can be a lot of congenital diseases contracted, and it's difficult science, and it gets perfected along the way. But, are we going to possibly have a lot of failed elephant mammoth hybrids being made before the famous one hits the headlines? These types of issues need to be thought about far before we even get into the environmental effects they might have. But then also there's considerations around legal issues, because these animals are hugely biotechnologically interrogated in terms of how they're made. There's gene editing to think about. There's clear inventive steps. They would be patentable in places like the United States because they wouldn't be seen as a product of nature. And so that opens up all sorts of interesting questions about who could license such a patent based on how deep their pockets might be, and would people maybe want to profit from these recreated animals in unecological ways. I've had conversations with scientists who have been, one in particular, it's a quite funny story. There's a woolly mammoth ancient DNA expert at McMaster University in Canada, and he was invited out to lunch over a $7,000 bottle of wine by a businessman who wanted to take him away from his academic post with a very, very lucrative offer to join his mission to recreate the woolly mammoth and then have them roam around in a park, essentially a park that you could charge tourists to come to. And it would be kind of a Jurassic Park 2.0, but with, Pleistocene style animals instead of dinosaurs, should they ever succeed. And he said, there's no way I'm going to join that. We should not be using these scientific insights to create animals for our own entertainment. We should only squarely pursue de-extinction if we can show that it will restore ecosystems in an interesting way and help the conservation effort. So you start to get into the weeds on where the various agendas lie and where the different interests could take us, which are concerning and need to be debated before we get there as any kind of reality.
Yeah, I particularly enjoyed the part of your book that dealt with ongoing conservation efforts, because I was never really aware that putting a species on the endangered animals list could actually put it at risk, meaning that the added rules and regulations could actually incentivize some people to, as you've said, shoot, shovel, and shut up. And I've been fascinated by de-extinction for quite a while, but admittedly, I've been more interested in it for the potential research benefit of being able to study living animals rather than bones, and perhaps a bit because I was just selfishly interested in actually seeing and experiencing some of these animals for myself. But after reading your book, I am convinced that the best reason to pursue de-extinction is for the potential environmental benefits, using these animals as a sort of geoengineering project. What are your thoughts on the potential conservation uses of de-extinction?
So I think that the most compelling ways that de-extinction can right now be used for conservation are to help us question what it means, firstly, when an animal goes extinct, because we tend to think before the last individual has died that the species is not extinct, that it's still around somehow, even if there's only 3 members of that species alive in some conservation area somewhere. But have they not gone extinct by that point? They're functionally extinct in the wild. So we have this ripple effect of extinction. It's a much more nuanced way of thinking of extinction rather than just on and off. And so if you can look at species that are still hanging on by a thread, such as the northern white rhino, where now there's only 2 left after the last male died in March, then you can see Okay, these tools, these kinds of gene editing, cloning, and even induced pluripotent stem cell technologies that we're learning to work with better and better and finessing in de-extinction, they can be applied to helping these endangered species that still have a lot of live available biomaterial for us to work and experiment with, which increases the chances of getting some of these systems working to de-extinct them. And then also because they're still around, that means that their habitats haven't changed that drastically in comparison with a species that was roaming the earth 12,000 years ago, and their biome has changed dramatically, making it more difficult to understand how we can sustain them should we create them and put them back. I think that that's a very fruitful way of thinking about de-extinction as conservation, because you're working with recent animals that are still here. They have a lot of good material to work with. You don't just have to go into decaying fossils, as you mentioned, and possibly you can do some real good for reconstituting and boosting the genetic diversity of species that are still here and still should be prioritized in terms of their possible savior. But then, as you mentioned, there's geoengineering theories about why we should do de-extinction. George Church's team at Harvard, they're working on recreating the woolly mammoth because they want to help stave off an unbelievable catastrophe with thawing permafrost in the Arctic. So it's not super intuitive to think about how recreating woolly mammoths would help stave off permafrost thawing, but the idea goes like this. In places like Siberia, where the woolly mammoth used to roam, back in the Pleistocene, it was much more bioabundant. There were many more animals running around doing their thing, hunting for a blade of grass in the winter months, for example. And now, after the megafauna extinction that happened, there's far less activity up there. So for much of the year, it's covered by a thick blanket of snow, and underneath that blanket of snow is permafrost. And this permafrost contains enormous amounts of carbon because there have been millennia's worth of animals that have lived there and died and fallen into the ground. They are made of carbon, but even more impressively, all the vegetation that they fed on. And so this carbon is trapped in this permafrost, but we've learned that the permafrost isn't actually permanently frozen because with climate change, things are warming and those soils are thawing and they're releasing the carbon contents into the atmosphere, which becomes quite dangerous because there are microbes everywhere that chew away at this carbon content and they turn it into carbon dioxide or methane, depending on the environmental conditions. And those are two of the greenhouse gases that exacerbate warming as we have it, which would then cause more permafrost to thaw in this reinforcement loop, which is very dangerous because there's an estimated 2 times as much carbon trapped in the Arctic permafrost soils as there is already in the atmosphere that we're desperately trying to figure out how to manage properly. So people are thinking very innovatively about how we can possibly try and keep these permafrost soils frozen. And so this blanket of snow is somewhat insulating. It keeps things underneath it warmer than they would be otherwise if you had a lot of large marauding animals running around punching holes in the snow with, for example, their large mammoth feet. And by creating perforations in this blanket of snow, the idea is that you could have frigid air from the atmosphere coming down, cycling to hit the permafrost topsoil and freezing it. So they become basically large mobile ventilation systems. And that's why his team has proposed starting with about 80,000 recreated woolly mammoth elephant hybrids and moving them into Siberia in order to help stave off this thawing that otherwise is just inactive right now and it's thawing away. So there have been some tests with trampling of the snow in a place called Pleistocene Park in Siberia where they've used extant animals, so available animals that are here now, like reindeer, for example. And from seeing a lot of increased trampling of snow in some areas, they have measured a 15 degrees Celsius temperature drop on those soils. So there's some evidence to say that it could work. Now, could we then just do this and help the permafrost soil thawing problem by using available animals, those that are already here? Do we really need to recreate woolly mammoth elephant hybrids in order to get that job done?
Yeah, you brought up George Church there, the Harvard geneticist currently working on the de-extinction of woolly mammoths. And he actually wrote the foreword for your book.
Yes.
How did his involvement in your project come about?
Well, I had met George at a variety of science conferences in the past, just, nothing explicitly to do with the book. But I, had been following his research on de-extinction very closely, of course, him being the leader in the field that he is, and then taking on the woolly mammoth project. And because he is creating such a foundational mark in the subject of de-extinction, and I've interviewed him for a variety of other science journalism projects, my publisher and I just thought that it would be fantastic if he could weigh in with a foreword, and we asked him, and he was very kind to agree. So it was pretty simple, just in terms of us seeing if he'd be interested, and yeah, he and I had a chat, and then he said yes.
On the topic of George Church, Rise of the Necrofauna also mentions his book titled Regenesis: How Synthetic Biology Will Reinvent Nature and Ourselves. In Regenesis, Church mentions the possibility of Neanderthal de-extinction. This is a controversial topic, and in your book, you say that Church knows that, quote, societal acceptance must come before any enthusiasts wish to volunteer their uterus for this purpose.
Mm-hmm.
This gets into an area which I'm very conflicted about. There are certainly conversations around ethics and risk analyses that must be conducted when considering projects like this, but at the same time, I have issues with the idea that society should have any say in what an individual does with their own uterus. What do you think is the path forward here? How do we balance bodily autonomy with making sure that the work being done is both safe and ethical?
Yeah, it's a fascinating question. I think on the issue of Neanderthal de-extinction, this is certainly an issue that's up for public debate, because it not only affects our common human lineage, because it would be an enormous step in modification of our species in terms of hybridizing ourselves with somewhat distantly related other bipedal, very intelligent creatures that we once shared the earth with and once even procreated with. But it creates some very, very tough ethical issues to grapple with in terms of what that Neanderthal would be like if it should ever get made. I mean, imagine you woke up in some laboratory one day in the future surrounded by a variety of creatures that were not your species. You're the only one of your kind there, popping out of one of their wombs or whatever contraption they used to make you. And how would you learn how to be yourself? How would you learn how to be a human if there were no humans there to teach you how to be a human? And you had an enormous intellectual cognitive capacity, and you were a very social creature by nature, but you're confined to this existence where you're basically poked and prodded your whole life and studied and not able to carry out your natural way of being. That would be analogous to the recreation of a Neanderthal, which is a species that we have given an incredibly bad rap by drawing them in cartoons with these gargantuan features as though they're some kind of brutish form of life. But they're incredibly intelligent and deserve dignity. And I mean, there are just unbelievable amounts of ethical questions that would come with trying to reconstitute them, or to merge our own germline with theirs and produce some kind of inheritable effects that would change the future of the Homo sapiens story. So I think it's fair that that's a question that's up for societal debate, and especially when it comes to what a powerful scientist might do alone in their lab without consulting people. Should they have the right to just do that and move forth when the lineage is something that is shared with all of us? I think there's a responsibility to be transparent, to be open, and to be willing to engage with a variety of different stakeholders when doing anything, anything that relates to these types of projects, let alone something so personal as using a human to make a Neanderthal in their body as some kind of surrogate. So I hear you on bodily autonomy. I mean, people should, I think, of course, also fight for bodily autonomy. But there's a difference between fighting for bodily autonomy and stopping all conversation about it whatsoever. I think that none of these issues should ever be closed from debate. Even if you have the debate, that doesn't mean that it's necessarily going to stop the experiment from proceeding. And a lot could be learned in the process of having that debate in terms of how to do it in the most ethical ways.
In the final chapter of Rise of the Necrofauna, you bring up the Frankenstein Complex, which you define as the fear of encroaching on God's terrain through technology. This is a new use of this term for me. Typically, I hear Frankenstein Complex refer more specifically to humanoid robotics or artificial intelligence, but I like the broader definition that you used. How do you see the Frankenstein Complex relating to the topic of de-extinction, and what lessons may we learn from the Frankenstein story?
I think that we see this Frankenstein complex riddled throughout all forms of synthetic biology and biotech experiments, where you can see people get upset still about GMOs, calling them frankenfoods, just because they automatically attach this connotation of making monsters when tinkering with parts of an organism and hybridizing two different organisms into one unique being. And so we see this also with de-extinction. People get squirmish. They feel afraid, and that it might be encroaching on God's terrain when we take the technological powers we have to do something so direct in terms of how it intervenes in an evolutionary tract. Because we no longer have to wait for Darwinian evolution to happen. We can step in and form it in whatever ways we like with these tools that we have, which is becoming more and more possible and more precise. And so this is integral to de-extinction and how these species are being worked on, whether that be by CRISPRing the closest living relative of an extinct species so that it contains unique DNA fragments of that extinct species in order to make the living species look and act like the extinct species. That is a process of tinkering and cobbling and bringing together different body parts essentially into a new unit that reminds us of Frankenstein. And I've heard that more than I've heard any kind of reaction to de-extinction so far. Well, perhaps the one that would compete with it is, that's so cool, we should do it, I really want to see a woolly mammoth, that would be awesome. I mean, people get really, really jazzed. Or they immediately go to Jurassic Park and say, wow, this is humans being dumb again, overstepping their reach, acting like God, and they're going to get bitten badly for it. So we see these tropes coming in again through the de-extinction discourse, just at a very low-lying level even. And I think that there are some really interesting lessons to be learned from Frankenstein, which I first had retaught to me from the readings of Bruno Latour, the French anthropologist / philosopher of science, who pointed out that, you know, a lot of people in the mainstream identification of Frankenstein forget that Victor Frankenstein is the doctor. Victor Frankenstein is responsible for what happens to his creature, but the creature itself is not called Frankenstein. People might think that they're dressing up as Frankenstein for Halloween and dress as the monster, but not the doctor. And the thing is that Frankenstein, the scientist who is responsible for his creature, actually is also the reason why the creature eventually becomes mean, because the creature at the beginning is benevolent and wants a companion and wants to be cared for in order to have, you know, a life worth living, but only turns mean, only becomes the scary monster that we all remember it for after it's been abandoned by its creator, by Victor Frankenstein, who no longer takes responsibility for what he's created and then gives rise to the problem of this menacing aftermath of having created this new form of creature, of life. And so Bruno Latour points out that the lesson of Frankenstein is not that we should not make monsters. It's that we should take responsibility for what we create at every single step of the process before we make them, as we're making them. And then once they're here, we need to entwine ourselves with a responsible, caring bond. And so as that relates to de-extinction, it's not that Ben Novak shouldn't make passenger pigeons, shouldn't make, so to speak, de-extinction monsters or creatures, because they're not monsters. It's just that they need to be cared for, and we need to show that we can be mature, responsible scientists in the process of making de-extinction happen.
Yeah, I've tried to make it a personal rule to not bring up Jurassic Park in this conversation, but it really is hard to have a conversation on this topic without it coming up. As you point out in your book, there are a lot of concerns about the feasibility of recreating an extinct species. Even if the genome is 100% accurate, the animal would not be developing in a womb of the same species, and for this reason, there would be differences. Your book mentions Norman Carlin, an environmental lawyer with a PhD in biology that, because of these differences, uses the term facsimiles to refer to any unextinct animals. This makes sense to me, but there's now talk about the potential of one day using artificial wombs to develop human infants. If just the womb causes differences significant enough that an unextinct animal with 100% accurate genome could only be considered a facsimile to the extinct species, would a human born of an artificial womb actually be a facsimile of a human?
Oh, interesting. Well, in terms of de-extinction, the facsimile term comes about because it's referring to processes of hybridization that get used to make these animals. So, for example, the Asian elephant genome is the starting point for making a woolly mammoth, and then researchers can just go in and change parts of the Asian elephant genome so that it matches the woolly mammoth genome in parts where we understand how certain genes code for traits that woolly mammoths had that elephants don't. So you end up with this mixture of both Asian elephant and woolly mammoth genetic material in whatever animals might get made through this process, meaning that it's not the original woolly mammoth and it's not the elephant. It's a close version or an approximate facsimile. And then, of course, if you make an embryo that way and then you implant it in an elephant, which is where we're getting to the womb question you have, then there's different interactions that could occur between the developing gestating fetus and that elephant mother that is the surrogate that the original woolly mammoth never had, which could change it in terms of its microbes, its hormones. The way that it's going to develop could then affect its ability to carry out certain functions that elephants have, which woolly mammoths don't, et cetera, et cetera. And therefore, you can never call it the original. Now, if you were to use an artificial womb to create humans one day, presumably the DNA in that animal, well, humans are animals, the DNA in that human fetus that would be gestating in this artificial womb, that would all be human DNA. So it wouldn't be hybridized with a chimpanzee or anything similar. Therefore, when that baby is born, it's still human at the basis of its nuclear and mitochondrial DNA. And I think then people like Norman Carlin would probably not call it a facsimile. But you do raise an interesting point. Would there be enough differences because that womb or uterus is artificial compared to from a woman that could produce different effects in that baby? And we'll need to have a lot more research on that to know. But I imagine that in order to make this successful, they are going to try and simulate as much of the human maternal uterine environment as possible for gestating babies at some point. But it's an open question. I don't know. I'm not sure if that artificial womb could afford to have very many differences, because if it's going to be successful at growing a fetus to term that could live as a baby that grows into a human, I imagine a lot of those internal environments are going to have to be simulated very closely to what a woman provides its growing baby in her womb. We'll have to see.
Yeah, I think one of the things that makes this so difficult to discuss and come to a consensus on is that there's really no great definition of species. Your book mentions the biological species concept, which defines species as the largest group of organisms in which two individuals are able to reproduce fertile offspring. This is the standard I typically use as well, but it's still problematic. And there's so much variation between individuals within a species that I think I'd consider an animal officially unextinct if it fell within that species' natural range of variation, which is still a tall order. So to me, it seems as though de-extinction might be a misnomer. I'd personally say that if we're talking about facsimiles, we're not talking about actual de-extinction. And if we're talking about actual de-extinction, we're not talking about facsimiles. Am I being too strict with my definition here?
No, I think you're right. It's just that de-extinction has caught on as the word. De-extinction implies bringing back the original, but that's not possible for a variety of reasons that are outlined in the book, and some of which that we've touched on already here. So we are talking about facsimiles. We are talking about proxies. We're talking about tinkering and finessing to different points of perfection. And so, yeah, diversity is going to be the name of the game. And what you describe as being facsimile making is a more accurate way of talking about what de-extinction can actually achieve. But, de-extinction hit the headlines in 2012 as an organized movement that was collecting a bunch of projects that were widely dispersed across the globe that were trying to work on different cloning and gene editing approaches to recreating forms of extinct species. And it created this awkward word, which doesn't precisely describe what these techniques can do, but it is broad and general enough that it can collect and unify these different projects, even the ones that are using selective breeding techniques like the backbreeding projects of the aurochs, even that very different approach. They can all fit together under this banner of de-extinction now. And as long as you provide some extra wiggle room to nuance what you really mean by de-extinction, it can serve you just fine. But it is a bit of a misnomer if taken at face value.
So your book came out quite recently, in 2017, but the rate of technological advancement is speeding up. Have there been any big developments in the world of de-extinction since the book came out?
It's interesting because it is speeding up, but not enough to materially change that much at the moment in these projects. So one advancement that has come out since the book was published is that Ben Novak's research with the passenger pigeon is forging ahead. He has a very complicated method of engineering living pigeons, the band-tailed pigeon, to contain passenger pigeon DNA from the extinct bird in order to create these chimeras that can then be seen to carry passenger pigeon sperm and eggs in their gonads, so that when they grow up and get crossed with each other, a new generation is spawned that would be the quote-unquote passenger pigeon reborn. But really, of course, it's a facsimile between band-tailed pigeons and passenger pigeons. But it takes multi-steps and multi-generations, and it's very, very cutting-edge research to be able to get that kind of reproductive engineering working in avian species. However, he has now had some amazing results doing germline engineering with living pigeons. So this is before getting the passenger pigeon DNA into them, but he's shown a proof of concept that, CRISPRing in this method, which is the same that he would reproduce when inserting the extinct pigeon's DNA into the mix, it has worked. And he's actually been updating on Twitter with some amazing pictures of these genetically engineered germline CRISPR-Cas9 pigeon squabs that he's now set free into the world. They're healthy, they're fat, they've been passed over to surrogate parents that are taking care of them. It's really quite remarkable. So that bodes well for his progress once he starts actually doing the germline engineering with the extinct passenger pigeon DNA in the band-tailed pigeons. And otherwise, there's been some more sophisticated philosophical debate, many more publications added to the mix from a variety of ethicists and philosophers and conservationists and even economists thinking about what the world might be like should de-extinction become a more regular part of it. Debating the pros and the cons. So there's always more interesting arguments to take in, but we're still waiting to see some of the next big steps from the technological side of things in terms of their achievement. I think that we might see something relatively soon from George Church's group as they get further and further into their editing of woolly mammoth DNA into Asian elephant cells, because they've already edited well over 50 woolly mammoth genes into Asian elephant cells, and I know that they're working on making those edits all at one time in a master cell, aka an embryo, which we might hear something about. They at one point said by 2019.
We've spent a lot of time talking about your book, but you have a lot of other interesting projects going on as well. What is your background, and how did you first get interested in the world of science and technology?
My background is in biology in terms of what I studied in university and what I worked on out in the field and in the lab for several years. But I have moved from biology into broadcasting and writing about biology. Although I really focused on evolutionary ecology and conservation biology when I was studying and working in the lab, I now am fascinated with the biotechnological side of things and the various forms of new nature that we're developing, because they bring with the technological possibilities so many gripping ethical, social, environmental, legal questions that I absolutely love digging into. I find it's a really fascinating time to work in science and technology in order to shed light on the deep, deep social ties that many of these innovations have that can often get skirted over in the pursuit of, just knowledge about scientific progress. So I really try to situate my work as a broadcaster and a storyteller. I do a podcast with the BBC, and I am hosting radio and television with the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation. And I just finished my PhD in science communication with a focus on synthetic biology. And in all those spaces, as much as possible, I try to, as you mentioned you do with your podcast, tease out the social and ethical questions that come with these fascinating new scientific possibilities. But how I originally got into even becoming a biologist, I mean, that I think comes just down to a really, really good high school science teacher that inspired me and made me feel like I had some natural tact for this area, and that if I pursued it, I could do really amazing things with it. So the right influences at the right time, but also always being an animal lover, very, very naturally fascinated by zoology, and wanted to understand that from a scientific side. And then once I was already deep into the science, I started to switch over into the communication side of things because of David Attenborough. Straight up, I was obsessed with all of his BBC documentaries, and loving natural history and seeing how he could bring it to life and make people care, and particularly in these times of mass extinction, where the extinction crisis is very enormous, and our biggest obstacle is making people care about it in order to get policy and societal shifts to accompany it. I thought that I could have a greater impact if I went into the messaging side of things rather than the research side of things, which is how I became preoccupied with storytelling.
Well, I completely agree with you there. Those David Attenborough BBC documentaries were always a favorite of mine as well. And you touched upon your own work with the BBC, which I'd love to get into shortly. But first, I'm always fascinated by the new insights and fresh perspectives that come from multidisciplinary approaches to topics. For example, you have an undergraduate degree in biology, a master's in art, media, and design, and now a PhD in science communication. How do you feel that these varied disciplines impact one another and inform your work?
Yeah, I'm very interdisciplinary in everything that I do, that's for sure. And that's been taught to me formally, as well as it's something I've just picked up very informally based on the communities I hang out with, whether that be artists working in biology or designers working with technologists or whatever it might be. I mean, I did do this interdisciplinary master's program at a fine arts school. It's called the Interdisciplinary Masters of Art, Media, and Design. And there in my thesis, I was able to focus on synthetic biology, but study the activity of artists and designers in the field of synthetic biology, which really normalized interdisciplinary research to me and showed me how exciting it really can be to bring people from different backgrounds together into one space where the questions that they ask can be brought together and unified into a totally new tertiary research area that doesn't exist just within biology or just within art. But the magic happens when you get specialists from these two different areas coming together, combining their thoughts and asking questions of each other that push thinking in a new direction. And I just think that this Renaissance approach to tackling problems and finding solutions for a lot of the issues we're grappling with is so vital. It's extremely important. And I was particularly taken with the fact that synthetic biology as a field being pretty young in terms of the way that it's rebranded itself from, not being your average old genetic engineering, but something specific in the mid 2000s. It's been very, very, very open to working with artists and designers and philosophers and different kinds of critical thinkers. And I thought that was very refreshing and something that I didn't see reproduced in the kinds of biology that I studied. So that kind of reinforced my interest in interdisciplinarity, but also, a lot of scientists aren't just scientists; they're musicians as well, they're artists as well, whatever it might be. And to be able to collapse those different areas of activity into one main focus is, I think, a really exceptionally exciting thing to be able to do, rather than to just keep your hobbies on the side, but bring them together and have a creative studio that's also a lab, and collaborate with people who know so much more about different areas, I think that always turns out to be a fruitful way to go.
You've mentioned synthetic biology a few times now, and both your master's degree and your PhD were related to this field. On the website of your project Orator, there's a quote: "In a room full of synthetic biologists, ask each one to define synthetic biology, and you'll get as many completely different answers as there are people in the room." So now I have to ask you, what is synthetic biology?
Yes. Synthetic biology, I think, is, to be honest, a rebranding of different types of genetic engineering and metabolic engineering and design processes with genetic sequences that we've had for a very long time. But it's been accelerated by new technologies, better sequencing and synthesizing technologies that allow us to do much more precise work in terms of genetic engineering. Also, there's been a very clear paradigm shift with synthetic biology that is different from other types of biological engineering that's come before it, where researchers have tried to make it the stuff of engineering. Biology becomes standardized, it becomes abstracted, it is worked with as though it's a nut and bolt. You know, when you have a nut and bolt, they screw together in this standardized form. So synthetic biologists took an approach to biology and genetic design, saying, let's abstract parts of the cell and parts of genetic material so that we can work with it in a dependable way across space, across time, and start to make little machines out of biological cells. Now, I think people are learning that it's really hard to just take that metaphor and apply it to biology, which is a complex environment to work in that isn't used to being standardized. It's not like a piece of metal that you can cut the same way thousands of times over and over again. But these are some of the hallmarks or the characteristics that make synthetic biology unique from other forms of biological engineering. It's a slippery concept. It's already morphing into something new as the momentum is moving away from being obsessed with turning biology into a hardcore engineering discipline. And people are talking way more about CRISPR-Cas9, for example, and that's becoming a new tool in the tool belt. So overall, I think synthetic biology is a collection of tools that allow us to intervene in the genetic materials of a variety of different organisms.
So we discussed our mutual admiration for the science and nature content from the BBC, and now you are one of those BBC content creators. You are a host of their Tomorrow's World podcast, which discusses how science will influence and change our lives. How did your work with the BBC come about?
To be honest, I got a call out of the blue one day, and it was kind of my dream call to receive because it was a producer making a new podcast for the BBC, and they said, we want it to be really colorful, full of a lot of sound design, very wacky and experimental, and we want it to take some risks in terms of the subjects we explore, like, brain-machine interfaces and artificial intelligence and what to do with climate change in dense cities in the future and building floating cities and things like this, or longevity researching, treating aging as a disease and curing all forms of aging and thus moving us towards immortality. And these types of topics that are still speculative but have real talented researchers working quite diligently on them now. So how can we project into the future? By looking at the current state of tech and then creating some bold narratives about where it could possibly take us and trying to make it entertaining at the same time. So I said yes, I would love to be a part of that. And it was just a fateful call one Wednesday afternoon, I think, last year.
Yeah, that sounds like a great call to receive. And you mentioned some of your upcoming projects with the CBC. What can we expect on that front?
On the CBC, there's a long-running television show called The Nature of Things, which David Suzuki is the host of, and he's, I'm not sure if people outside of Canada really know who he is, but in Canada, he's the guy. He's the public scientist he's a household name. Everyone loves him. He's a hardcore environmentalist, big climate change activist, and he's a geneticist. And so this is his show. But he's now traveling a little less. So sometimes hands off the show to other people. So I'm hosting, I've been filming the last 5 months on a film that's coming out with them about inventors. So that is a very, very broad topic. And without getting into the details, which I can't talk about right now, that's just the broad focus on what is the face, who are the real inventors today? What does that look like? Getting away from this paradigm of thinking about Thomas Edison all the time. And let's look at the diversity of what invention means today. And there are some surprising inventions in the film that I had no idea existed, which we cover. And then the CBC's radio show called Quirks and Quarks, which is the national science radio show, I'll be hosting this summer for a variety of weeks while Bob McDonald is enjoying summer vacation.
So you have the option to go an academic route, to continue as a writer, to put your efforts behind media production, to focus on art, and so much more. Where would you like to take your career? What would you like to be doing in the coming decades?
I would love to keep writing. I learned from the Rise of the Necrofauna undertaking that it's something I love to do. And it allows me to use my broadcast skills because so much of it is dependent on interviewing. And for me, the best part of working at this interface of science and society is getting to call people up who work in these areas that are incredibly fascinating, and to spend a lot of time with them, and to pick their brain. And I would love to keep interviewing for my living for the rest of my days. So whether that be through, television, radio, podcasting, book writing, I think I will maintain a probably diverse roster of doing different science communication projects, at least for the next few years. This is a continuation, I suppose, of what I've started doing more publicly in the last year or so. But now that the PhD is finished, I'm going to take some time to reflect on academic pursuits, and I might go back in that direction. But for right now, I'm going to stay away from the academy and just see how that feels. It's so easy to just continue forever, which is great. And I love teaching as well. But right now, I just want to see if I can make it in terms of keeping my academic research quality up, but being outside of the university. We'll see how that goes.
Well, congratulations on completing that PhD. And you have so many different projects going on. So if someone wants to keep up to date with your work, how can they follow along?
Oh, thank you. The best would be perhaps Twitter. I'm still trying to get a hang of using it all that regularly, but my work will appear there. So I am Britt Wray, just at Britt Wray on Twitter. Or you can go to my website, which is brittwray.com, which is definitely where I have an updated list of whatever's going on.
Great. I will put links to both of those, as well as some of your other work, in the show notes at futuregrind.org. Britt, thanks again for coming on the show.
Thanks so much for inviting me on. Good to talk to you.
Hey everyone, Ryan O'Shea again, and thanks for listening to my interview with Britt Wray. Remember to check out the show notes and more at futuregrind.org. Make sure to subscribe, take a few seconds to leave us a review, and you can also like, comment, and share to spread the word. Till next time, this is Future Grind.